Because we were snowed out of the church service today, what I thought I'd do is make a videotape of today's sermon. I'll put that up on YouTube, and if folks want to see it, they can. It's a kind of important Sunday in the church year. This is Transfiguration Sunday. So listen first for our lessons this morning. First from the epistle to the second epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 4, verses 3 to 6. We find there these words. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. And in their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers and kept them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord and ourselves as the slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is this the God who said, "Let light shine out of the darkness," who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus. And in the Gospel of Mark, we find there these words from chapter 9, verses 2 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up to a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." And suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, only Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them not to tell anyone about what that they had seen, until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The title of our sermon today is The Turning Point. We've come to a turning point in the church year. One of the end of one season and the beginning of another. And this is a big one. The big season is coming up. We have Lent and Easter, the holiest times, holiest days of the Christian calendar. This Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. It's a real turning point when we begin our 40-day journey towards Good Friday and the cross, towards Easter Sunday and the celebration of our Lord's resurrection. This Sunday is the last Sunday of the season called Epiphany. Now I want you to see the significance of this Sunday in the lesson that was read to you this morning from the Transfiguration. First of all, there's what you could call a literary echo of that first Sunday in Epiphany. The lesson read on that first Sunday is the story of Jesus' baptism in the River Jordan, when the heavens opened up and the voice from heaven says, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Now on this last Sunday of Epiphany, we have the story of the Transfiguration. The heavens opened up again, and a voice speaks again and says, "This is my beloved Son." And then this addendum, "Listen to him." So there's this sense of completion, the sense of coming full circle, the sense of rounding out the first part of this mission, the teaching part of Jesus' mission. The season ends and begins the same way, with a voice speaking a word of confirmation from the heavens. This is my Son. This incident is also a turning point in Jesus' life. Up to this point, he spent all of his time in Galilee, which is his home country, among people who would identify him as a fellow Galilean. The way people from certain regions of this country have a cultural affinity with each other. They can recognize each other. They have immediately this sense of fellowship with one another. But when Jesus comes down from the mountain and heads to Jerusalem, he begins a new phase of his life. In Jerusalem, he'll be among strangers. There'll be those in Jerusalem who do not know him, whose inclination is not to take him seriously because he's from Galilee. There'll be others in Jerusalem who do not know him personally, but know of him from their investigations. They have files on him from the secret police, and they're waiting to do away with him. So this story marks a turning point in Jesus' life, and it's a major turning point. Things are going to change from here on out dramatically. It's also a turning point in the lives of the disciples as well. In my opinion, what happened up there on the Mount of the Transfiguration was for the disciples. It was for Peter and James and John, but especially for Peter. This transfiguration scene is especially for Peter. This is what he saw, and what I believe he took with him as he traveled around as an apostle to all those early churches in Christendom. And he told the story of what happened to him up on the Mount of Transfiguration. And so I have another assumption, that the Transfiguration story was told by Peter to the churches and is included in the gospel because this could happen to us. This is not just his story. Most of the stories that are told to the disciples are there to tell you what happened to them, but could also happen to us. Now that may seem kind of far-fetched, especially with this story, with this strange vision, and the details that are so specific to Peter's time. The details of this vision are what today we would call culturally specific. That is to say, you had to be there. You had to be a part of the culture in order to understand them. I mean, look at them. First of all, he's on a mountain. Anyone in the Bible going up on a high mountain is going there for a purpose, for a vision of God. Anyone in that culture would have known that Moses went up the high mountain to receive a revelation from God. Anyone in that culture would have known that Elijah went up a high mountain to receive a vision from God. And so when someone goes up on a mountain in the Bible, that means get ready for an epiphany. Get ready for a revelation. And this trip up the Mount of Transfiguration is no exception. Now I have another assumption. Remember on Maundy Thursday when Jesus was in Jerusalem with the disciples just before the crucifixion, on that last night of his life, he leaves the upper room and goes up on another mountain, the Mount of Olives, to pray. And he went there for the same reason that anyone goes in the Bible up to a mountain, to have a vision of God, a word from God, an epiphany, a revelation. And Jesus takes with him the same three disciples who are with him on the Mount of the Transfiguration. He takes Peter and James and John. And while Jesus prays on the Mount of Olives, the disciples will fall asleep. So I suggest that we have the same pattern here in this story. Jesus goes off to the mountain to pray. He takes with him Peter, James, and John, that executive committee of the disciples, you can call them. They're the inner circle. Peter, the first disciple, about whom Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church." And John is there. There's a tradition in the church that says that John is the one closest to Jesus. The beloved disciple, he's called in the Gospel of John. And so they're there. The ones important to Jesus are there with him on this mountain as he prays. Maybe they're sleeping, who knows? It seemed to be their habit when Jesus prayed through the night. And then it happens. Peter sees Jesus transfigured. His appearance is changed to dazzling white. And then Moses appears, and Elijah appears, one on either side of Jesus. And then a voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Now, if you're going to have an epiphany, it probably won't look like that because you're not a first century Jew. But Peter was a first century Jew. And he and anyone else living in that day would have gotten the meaning of this vision immediately. Jesus' dazzling appearance is a sign of divinity. In the Old Testament, whenever God appears, it's always in a dazzling light. so that you can't look upon God. In the Old Testament, light is referred to as glory. Whenever glory appears, that means God is present. So that's what it means to Peter, that Jesus would be dazzling white, like the sun, is that he finally saw that God was with Jesus. In other words, for a moment he saw the inner reality of Jesus manifested as an external glory. Paul later in the Corinthians would state categorically that God was in Christ. But this is the language of imagination. This is the language of vision. It says the same thing by saying that Jesus was dazzling white. And the two men, one on either side of him, we have Moses, the lawgiver, and Elijah, the first prophet. There's a saying in Judaism, the law and the prophets. That meant that all authority was there. So for Jews like Peter, to have Elijah and Moses there meant that the highest authority has now confirmed that Jesus is the Messiah. It's like two old ex-presidents holding up the hand of the new candidate saying, this is the one you've been waiting for. And then just in case there's any lingering doubt, a voice from heaven says, this is my son, which is what Jesus heard privately at his baptism. And now Peter hears it as well. And then to drive home the meaning to all of us, like Peter, who have dull minds, the voice adds, listen to him. Now that's the Transfiguration. That's a confirmation experience for the disciples like Peter, who wondered if they'd made a mistake in following Jesus, considering what had happened. And is presented to them in symbols and visual language so that he could understand symbols out of his culture. So if you're to have an epiphany, it's going to be in the same way. It'll be in a language or in images that are familiar to you. Images out of your own experience. Now it's also important to notice the time in which all this happens. Jesus and Peter have had a falling out. That's the only way you can describe it. It was an ugly scene. The story of the Transfiguration begins with these words. It says, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John to a high mountain apart. 6 days later. So what happened 6 days before? Well, 6 days before the Transfiguration, they were at Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus asked Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter boldly said, you are the Christ. And then Jesus says, finally, you got it. Now I'm going to go to Jerusalem and face those who want to do away with me. And Peter shouted him. He shouted at him saying, God forbid, which is like saying, no, you're not. It's crazy. You'll ruin everything if you do that. And Jesus called Peter an agent of the devil. And he repeated that he was going to Jerusalem. And anyone who was still his disciple would take up his own cross and follow him. Peter was crushed. His dream was shattered. His faith was shaken. Because of the popularity of Jesus in Galilee, Peter just assumed that if they waited long enough, that popularity would spread throughout the whole land, and finally everyone in Israel would claim that Jesus was Messiah and recognize him for who he really is. And with Jesus' ascension to power as the Messiah, Peter too would experience an ascension to power, sitting at the right hand of Jesus when he came into his kingdom. It's going to be wonderful, Peter thought. He must have thought about it often. Evidently, all the disciples thought about what it would be like when Jesus came into his glory, because the number of times it's mentioned that the disciples were discussing among themselves where they would sit on the dais of the Messianic banquet. Who would be the first in the kingdom? That's what Peter's thinking. Peter's thinking glory, honor, power. And Jesus says it's going to be humility, suffering, and sacrifice. What kind of Messiah is this? What's he up to? No, says Peter, God forbid. And he rebuked Jesus. And Jesus rebuked Peter. That means it was a shouting match. They're calling each other names. I imagine for 6 days it was tense. Awfully quiet. Not much said about among the disciples except pass the salt. Things like that. And after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and went up to a high mountain apart. Don't you see, this was a time of dissonance, a time of conflict. Relationships were strained. Differences between them were brought out into the open. Hopes had disappointed. That's what happened. Remember, Moses and Elijah appear in the vision as symbols of authority. But they appear there for another reason as well. Because both of them went up to the mountain to have their authority confirmed. And both of them went up to the mountain in times of depression or conflict in their lives. So the lesson is, in such times of dissonance in your life, expect an epiphany. Expect a breakthrough in understanding. Expect God to bring a reconciliation. Expect a confirmation. Expect a transformation. Expect a new direction in your life. In a time of dissonance and tribulation, open your life to God. That's what this story is telling us. Go up to a high mountain and open your life to God. Expect a vision. That's the scariest part, I'm sure, for most of us. Visions have gotten a pretty bad reputation from psychology. They're confused with hallucinations, just projections of inner fears and anxieties, hopes and dreams on the outside world. But that's not what the Bible means by vision. There's a difference. The Bible means something very different by a vision. It means seeing what God gives you the ability to see. That was there all along, but you didn't see it. The eye is just an instrument. The vision is a gift. The eye will not see what is there unless you know what to look for. It's like those picture puzzles with those objects hidden in the leaves of trees, or in the bark. You have to know what you're supposed to be looking for, or you won't even notice it. The eye is just an instrument. The vision is a gift. The brain is just an instrument. It has to be programmed to receive data. You interpret sensory data the way you're conditioned to experience it. That's the importance of education. That's what it's all about. It gives you the ability to see and interpret and understand sensory data. That's what's so important about religious education and Bible study. They prepare you to see the dimension of the sacred in the world. That's why Jesus said, there are those who have eyes to see, but they still can't see. No one can really see what's going on if one has a closed mind. One will not really see what is out there if one has a hardened heart. One will not really see what is really there if one has a barren soul. Because we don't see with the eye. We see through the eye. The eye is an instrument. The vision is a gift. So what happened on the Mount of the Transfiguration was a vision in this biblical understanding of the word. God gave Peter the gift to see something that had been there all along, but he had been blind to. That God is with Jesus, and God is with us. And when he saw it, it transformed his life. The details of that vision were common to Peter. They were the things he lived with every day. The circumstances were personal to Peter. It was a time of dissonance and conflict in his life. The vision was given to him to be redemptive. It restored his faith and his conviction. James Agee has written a wonderful book called Death in the Family. It's really about his father. He said that at the funeral of his father, as they were lowering the casket down into the grave, a butterfly landed on top of the casket. And it did what butterflies do. It slowly moved its wings in and out. The butterfly, he said, rode the casket all the way down to the bottom. And when it got to the bottom, the butterfly flew away into the sky. Agee wrote this. He said, there was more of God in that butterfly than in all the words the preacher said. The eye is just an instrument. You see through it, not with it. There's something else that enables you to see. There's something else that gives you eyes to see. And that is the gift.